Hello everybody, and welcome to this session of the Curious Festival today, which is on communication and collaboration in a crisis. I should start by extending that welcome from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which has been organising the Curious Festival, and from myself. My name is Stephen Reicher. I'm a social psychologist at the University of St Andrews, and I'm also one of the vice presidents of the RSE. I'm the vice president for arts, humanities, and social sciences. As you know, as I've already said, today's session is on communication and collaboration in a crisis. And in many ways, it relates to something which I think has been quite central to the response to the pandemic, certainly in Scotland. And it was, I think, very well articulated by Nicola Sturgeon, by the First Minister, when she referred to an adult conversation around the pandemic, an adult conversation about what the position was, what the issues were, and how we should respond. And in many ways, what we're going to do today is we're going to interrogate that notion of an adult conversation. First of all, is such a conversation possible? Is it possible to have a two-way conversation between government and the public? A conversation in which the government speak openly and transparently and honestly to the public, but also, and this is critical, that the public can answer back, that the voice of the public enters into the policy process, is heard by politicians and policymakers and practitioners. Is a conversation something that normally happens between two individuals, possible between two very broad entities, like a government and like a public? The second question, in many ways, is in what ways did we do things well and did we do things badly? How good were the communications? Where did they succeed? Was Scotland a shining example? In some ways, did we have failures? In other ways? The third question is, what do we learn from the pandemic more broadly? What do we learn about the possibility of a society in which government and the people listen to each other, hear each other, respond to each other? Does the pandemic provide a model more generally about how the relationship between government and people should be run? So very big themes and very broad themes, and hopefully we can be as open and frank as possible, and not only speak to what we've done well, but be honest about our limitations and honest about our failures, because of course in the end we only get better by recognizing what we did wrong and making sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. And in order to address those issues, we have, as in all the Curious events, a superb lineup of people. Starting with Jason Leach, who I think will be known to all of you. I was going to refer to him as the voice of the pandemic, but that makes him sound rather sinister. I mean, something out of a David Cronenberg film, the voice of the virus. I don't know if viruses speak, but perhaps more accurately, I think Jason, as National Clinical Director, has been the voice of the pandemic response. Certainly, he has been the messaging in many ways, and a voice we've heard regularly over the last 18 months, and no doubt we will hear for many months to come. And it's always a pleasure to hear from Jason. The second person on the panel is Anne Templeton, Dr. Anne Templeton, who is a psychologist at the University of Edinburgh. And Anne has been very much involved in doing research on messaging during COVID-19. She was heavily involved in the large events research program, looking at how we could message people to behave safely in large events. At the moment, she's involved in a very exciting research project looking at behavior in hospital settings and in healthcare settings. And again, asking what forms of messaging are effective in getting people to behave safely, to keep themselves safe, to keep others safe, to distance when necessary, to wear masks when necessary, and so on. And last, but very far from least, we have Alan Farmer from the Cora Foundation. And the Cora Foundation is very much involved in these issues of giving voice to community, empowering communities, making sure that communities are an active participant in the policy-making process, and that their concerns are heard and feed into the policy-making process. So I hope we have all angles covered. So let me just say a word or two about how the session will run. We will start off by having a conversation amongst ourselves, so to speak, for the first 20-25 minutes, the first half of the session. And then after that, we will open it to questions, and we will endeavor to do our very best to answer your questions. We're not politicians, so we will answer your questions as much as we possibly can. And you can start submitting questions as soon as you like through the question and answer function. Okay, so let's get going with the actual session. And I'm going to start, Jason, with you about the messaging. And I'm going to start off nice and gently so I can get more vicious as the conversation unfolds, by asking you what you think has been done well. What are you proudest of in terms of the communication and turning this aspiration of a national conversation into a reality?
Afternoon, Steve, and everybody else. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much for asking me. It's a fantastic subject, and one I feel entirely unqualified to answer other than experientially. So I have been thrown into this a little in the last 18 months. I always knew I could speak out loud in a straight line, but I didn't know this would be the subject on which I would be forced to do it. I think what's gone well is actually quite a lot of the stuff you don't see. I've learned a great deal about communication that you and others have taught me. And I've learned that there are people who understand it. There is a science. Part of that science is represented here today by Anne and you and Alan. But it turns out, just as a small anecdote, if you want to speak to Orkney, there's no point in being on the Today programme. That's an irrelevance to Orkney. What you have to do to speak to Orkney is be on Radio Orkney at 6 o'clock every evening, if you want to speak to Orkney, because that's what Orkney does. If you want to speak to Oban, you should probably get in the Oban Times, because the vast majority of Oban take a weekly newspaper. I haven't read a weekly newspaper for 20 years. So there are people who help with that. And I think we've done that really well. We've got experts in the government. We've got experts out in the system. You have come in and helped us. Others have helped us to do that. And the other invisible bit is the stakeholder columns. So everybody just thinks I and my colleagues have spent all our time in the news studios. That's not true. We have spent a lot of time in the news studios, but actually I've spent more time in stakeholder groups, whatever you might call them, faith groups, hospitality groups, people who represent young people, who represent the African diaspora, whatever section of society you want to talk about. And I've learned a great deal, and my principal learning in there has been about dialogue. It's been about, of course, going with content expertise about vaccination, about testing, about whatever the latest thing is that week, but also hearing back from that community. Now, that community could be women, it could be half the country, or it could be Arran and the challenges with ferries. It can be massively varied. But hearing back from whatever those challenges are and trying to adapt the communication, give the best advice you can from your context, because you can't walk in their shoes and they can't walk in yours.
So that's the good news. Various politicians, of course, when they are asked about errors, will start singing Edith Piaf and tell you that je ne regrette rien. Is there anything you regret? Anything you think has been done badly? Any mistakes that have been made? Anything that you would change if you were starting all over again?
I think there are technical things, response things that we will look back on and wonder if the timing was right, wondering if the messaging was right. I think one of the things I've learned that I wish I had done more of was, and this may horrify some of the stakeholder groups, is not just do it once. It is build relationship inside the communication. Does that make sense? So I've got multiple examples, but one of the groups I've spent a lot of time with are Scotland's faith leaders. They meet fortnightly and they represent all faiths and no faiths. So the interfaith group is there, the humanists are there, the Baptists are there, the Jewish community is there. And because I have paid in over a long period and had fairly robust conversations with them, you can imagine, polite but robust, it allows you to go back when you need something. And what we needed a couple of months ago was, please open your institutions to vaccination and message about vaccination on our behalf, because you are the trusted voices. Now, if I had just walked in off the street with no emotion paid in, then why on earth would they have taken my call? But they had. And I think I could have done more of that. I think I could have got to know the stakeholder groups better, rather than parachuting in and doing Alzheimer's Scotland and leaving again, or Autism Scotland and leaving again. I think I have had a better effect when I've paid in over a longer period.
I mean, I think that's a critical issue, and I think we'll probably explore that a bit more with Anne in a moment, that in many ways, communication and messaging isn't only about the content of the messages, it's about building the trust that you need for people to heed those messages. And it seems to me that leads to a number of tensions and a number of contradictions, because one way of building trust is to acknowledge fallibility, to acknowledge that you make mistakes. On the other hand, for any politician to admit to a mistake is a very dangerous thing, because you know it will be exploited by your political opponents, and it will probably be used to try and silence you. So how easy do you think it is in the communication to admit to fallibility, to admit to uncertainty, and to admit to mistakes?
I think admitting to general fallibility is allowed. Admitting that you chose to get Christmas wrong is not allowed. And I have faced some of that. I've faced some of that in the media. I've faced some of it, some of the real horror on social media, which we might come to. But actually, I think it's perhaps artificial. I think perhaps the peak of the pyramid that makes the front page or makes the story for 24 hours because I stumble at the podium, or I say something that is misunderstood, or if you take a middle of the sentence out, you can make it that Jason cancelled Christmas, or Jason cancelled Mother's Day when he did no such thing. In fact, the sentence he said was, nobody can cancel Christmas, but we're asking you to have a different kind of Christmas. And that becomes a picture of me as the Grinch on the front page of the tabloids, which is funny, but it's just an example of how your message changes. So I have tried repeatedly to go back to what my mother taught me when I was 4 years old, when I don't know if this memory is real or she's told me since, when she sat me down on a bed and said, at times of crisis, son, revert to the truth. So I have tried every day to tell the truth as I know it that day. But if you replay my interviews from March 2020, they sound very different from August 2021, because this is an odd sentence. Truth has changed. What we know now is not what we knew then. So if you want to play the game of gotcha for the First Minister or the Leader of the Opposition or the clinical advisors, that's an easy game. You can absolutely, I'm quite sure we could even find some from you, Steve, if we looked back and replayed something from March, April 2020 and said, why did you say that about face coverings? Why did you say that about the way this virus affects older people or younger people? Of course. But the core of the message, I've got better at saying the date before I give an interview now. So I often say, in August 2021, the science says such and such. That's my only change. And I try and tell the truth in the moment. And I hope in the long run that serves me and the message well.
And I think that's a really interesting and important question about science communication more generally, because I mean, a lot of the time, it seems to me, there is a sense that science communication is about absolute authority. You get a whispering authority, you know, a David Attenborough, who we all love, saying, you know, in avuncular terms, we know this and we know that, as if that knowledge is absolute. The problem being that when the knowledge changes, if you had absolute faith, you can then go to absolute rejection. So how do you maintain that balance between saying, look, science isn't random, it's better than nothing, but it's the best knowledge we have at a point in time, and it could change. And masks, of course, are one of the great examples of that. We didn't have the evidence about masks early on. We got that evidence. So as you say, the truth changed. Or to take another example, now we know how the virus is airborne. and we know how important ventilation is. And probably ventilation is probably more important than hands-face space. So how do we deal with trying to give people confidence and authority, but at the same time being clear that this isn't absolute knowledge, it's contingent knowledge, and it's only our best understanding at this point of time? How do you try and square that circle?
I don't know how to square that circle entirely. I know some of the things I have done and some of the things we've done as a government. So to her great credit, the First Minister, like her politics or don't like her politics, early on in the process, last February, sat down with then Catherine Calderwood and I and said, having learned from swine flu, because she had been the health minister during swine flu with Sir Harry Burns as the chief medical officer, and said, I can't do the comms politically. That's not going to work. Of course, I'm the leader of the country, and of course, some of the comms has to be led politically, and I should be front and center of that, but I need clinicians beside me. So I think the mixture of scientific truth and judgment has been crucial. And sometimes I have dodged questions by saying, well, that's not a matter for me. That's a matter of judgment. The advice I am giving is that we should vaccinate X, Y, or Z. Whether the government do X, Y, or Z, and in what order they do X, Y, or Z, that's a matter for the government. And sometimes that's grey, sometimes it's black and white. It's very straightforward. Whether schools should open or not is not a matter for me. The risk of schools opening is a matter for me and my colleagues, and we can feed that into the equation, and the Cabinet and the First Minister can then take a view. We've tried to do that in a broad four harms way. So harm from the virus, harm to healthcare, harm to society, and harm to the economy. And we've got experts in each of those boxes to try and help us with that. The tricky bit is that usually we do that on the pages of scientific journals and not live on the telly. But we've had to play that out live on breakfast TV. And I think we've had some fantastic communicators across the UK media, including you, not to spare your blushes, Linda Bald, Davy, others who have stepped up into a high-risk place for academics, actually, and played out that science in real time. I think Linda's a really good example. She's gentle, she's authoritative, but she follows the science at the time. So you can play the gotcha game with Linda Bald as well, because you can find it has changed over time. But she comes across, along with others in that scientific communication community, very, very well. And I think it's an I would say this, of course, an underappreciated skill in clinical and life scientists to be able to do that, let's call it live on the telly or live on the football phone-in, because it turns out the most listened to radio program in Scotland is a football phone-in. So if you want to get across to young men what they should do during the pandemic, you got to get on the football phone-in. There's no point in being on the Today program. You've got to get on the football phone-in, and you've got to have an ability to communicate on the football phone-in. So that's the trick, to play it out in real time.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think you're quite right that the skill of communication is critical, and critical to academics as well. I mean, we are very good at communicating through academic papers that our mum, our dog, and nobody else reads, but communicating to millions of people in a way that goes to the heart of it, I think, is absolutely critical. And of course, since you've been praising others, nobody has done it better than you over the last 18 months. But I'll stop being nice to you now. That's as much as you're going to get. And I'll turn to Anne, who, as an academic, studies issues of influence, issues of leadership, issues of groups, and issues of messaging. So having heard from the messenger, I'm now going to turn, if you like, to the analyst of messaging. And Anne, what are the major lessons that you think are critical in terms of communicating well and communicating effectively around COVID and more generally?
It's a great question. I was really heartened, Jason, when you were talking about the importance of building relationships and knowing how to kind of approach different groups, because harnessing those group processes is something I really want to talk about. If we're trying to think about kind of key points that governments can take into account when communicating COVID-19 guidance effectively and working with communities, I think there are three key points. The first is that the governments need to be able to explain what the public needs to do and why they need to do it. And that includes giving enough information so that people know what to do and why they're having to do it. So for example, if we have messaging from Boris Johnson saying, stay alert, well, that's all very good and well. We can stay alert to COVID, but we don't know what to do about it. That's not about how to combat it. So I think something the Scottish Government has done really well is they've given they've told the public key practical steps to take to combat COVID. So they've said to self-isolate if you've been in contact with someone who's tested positive for COVID-19 and included descriptions of what self-isolation actually requires. And they've explained why people need to isolate even if they don't have symptoms. So they've given that clear information about what people need to do, how to do it, and why they need to do it. And that's so important when people are making individual risk assessments about how to behave in particular situations, because they're given full information so that they can make the best decisions. I mentioned group processes, and I think this is one of the main points that I would like everyone to take away from today, if can. Harness those group processes. Something I think that Scottish Government has done really well is they've harnessed this idea that following the COVID-19 guidance is in the interest of the group, that it's good for Scotland. So we're more likely to follow guidance if it's in our self-interest. But what's in our self-interest can include what's good for our group, whether that is our local community or the nation that we're in. And it might be that someone isn't worried about COVID because they don't see it as particularly risky to themselves if they're young and they're fit and they're able. But if we know that someone in our group, in our community is vulnerable, then harnessing that idea that to follow the guidance is good for our community, it's good for us as well, because what's good for our community is good for us. It enhances that care. And I think focusing on those benefits to the group and the benefits of following COVID-19 guidance for the group can be very persuasive. And something else that Scottish Government have done really well, and this particularly in their Scotland Cares campaign, groups have particular definitions or actions associated with them that we see as normative. They're expected behaviours as part of the group. And we can harness what it means to be part of that group when encouraging safe behaviour. So for example, in the Scotland Cares campaign, they focused on how caring for others in our community is an inherently Scottish thing. So to be in Scotland means you care for others in your community, and they gave clear guidance on how to provide that care, how to look out for the community. So it was very persuasive. And it was really interesting when you were talking about kind of leadership and knowing how to speak to people and who to speak to, Jason, because when we talk about leadership, well, when we see others as members of our group, we're more likely to trust them, to trust the information that they're giving, and we're more likely to be influenced by them. And the best leaders are those that we see as members of our group or embodying what it means to be part of our group. And so I think something that was done really well by likes of Jacinda Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon is they talked a lot about how COVID was affecting everyone and it was hard, but we were all in this together. And when they were setting out guidance on what to do, they were following that guidance as well. It's this idea of, we're all doing it, we're all in this together. But that can be very easily undermined. So for example, if you have government officials giving advice to self-isolate, whatever the guidance is, and then they go against it, such as testing their eyes and going for a drive, that can completely undermine that relationship with the public. It makes an idea of there's one role for the people giving the guidance and one role for the general public. It undermines the trust in the guidance, and it undermines the importance of the guidance as well, because if they're not following it, then people think it might not be that important. So it's really important that leaders are tapping into those kind of group processes, they're embodying what it means to be part of the group, and that they're following the guidance they give. Last point I want to make, and this really taps into Alan's work, so I don't want to lean on it too heavily, but making sure that the guidance is inclusive so that people are actually able to follow the guidance. It's all very well you giving guidance, people trusting the guidance you're giving, but if they can't actually follow it, then you're going to get people not following the guidance. Governments can acknowledge that some guidance is going to disproportionately affect certain communities, and they can make plans to support them and give them resources to actually follow that guidance. Now, on one hand, that might be in the events research programme. This is for underrepresented communities, but in terms of giving that sort of practical ability to follow, if you have queuing systems, making sure they're able to be 2 meters apart. People in queuing systems are able to be 2 meters apart. If you're looking at communities who are underrepresented, for example, if you're looking at low socioeconomic status communities, research has shown that they're 6 times less likely to be able to work from home. They're 3 times less likely to be able to self-isolate. So if you're saying stay at home, isolate, and people need money for food, it's very difficult for them to actually isolate. So giving resources to underrepresented communities to be able to actually follow the guidance is so critical, and it's so critical in building that trust. And one of the ways governments can do that is by working with people in the communities, working with community leaders, people who know what that community needs, and going and building up those relationships so that they're co-producing the guidance, that they're co-producing decisions to enable people to follow the guidance.
Well, that was immensely rich, and we could spend an hour on that alone. And I think you've pointed to, I mean, 3 absolutely key factors in any issues of behavior and behavior change. I mean, the first, as you say, is clarity of information. I remember the polling that was done showed that when people were asked if they understood stay at home, well, 96% did, because it means stay at home. I don't know what the other 4% were thinking, but when it changed to stay alert, only 31% of people understood that, because what the hell does stay alert to a virus mean? I mean, I can't see the damn thing, so I don't quite know what it means. The second, as you say, is resources. I mean, it's all very well for people to be motivated. You need the opportunity. If you ask people to self-isolate, they've got to be able to self-isolate. A lot of the time, right at the beginning, when there was all the publicity about COVIDiots who were congregating in parks, well, where were they supposed to go if they went outside? And the answer wasn't to call them COVIDiots, it was to make more public space available, perhaps golf courses, so that people could walk on those as well, and giving people opportunities. But as you say, motivation. And I think one of the things that's coming over more and more clearly, both I think from Jason and from yourself, is that communication is about establishing a relationship as well as about giving information. And the 2 are interdependent. Because after all, if I give you information about things you don't know about, you've got to trust me that this is accurate information. So I think the role of trust and building trust with people becomes an absolutely central psychological question. And I think while I would love for us to have a conversation about building trust, I'm going to turn, in a sense, to Alan to begin to address that issue, because I think it's central to the work he does. But I'm going to start off with a slightly different question. I'm sure we'll get on to trust in a moment. And that is, I mean, in many ways, what the pandemic has done is reveal many profound things about the nature of our society. It's shown us something about the inequalities in our society. It's shown something about the importance of connectedness and the dangers of loneliness. But it's also shown us something quite remarkable about the power of communities. I remember early on, and I'm sure the figures have changed, and this was UK data, some 3,000 to 4,000 mutual aid groups had set up. That was the tip of the iceberg, because there were many, many more groups. There were neighborhood groups and so on. And something like 12 million people were involved in looking out for each other in a way that the state could never do. You know, looking after neighbors, making sure they were okay. The state can only do so much. So it's shown us the power of community when it comes together and the importance of the community. But at the moment, a lot of those mutual aid groups are having problems keeping going. They're getting burnt out. They don't have resources. So I think one of the questions is, in many ways, what has this pandemic taught us about community, the importance of community, and the relationship between the state, between government and community groups? And does it provide a model going forward for perhaps a healthier and more productive form of society?
Thanks, Steve. I think, as you've said, there was a significant upsurge in community activity at the start of the pandemic. And I suppose what we saw, building on the point about relationships, was a lot of the red tape falling away, the relationship between citizens and state, communities and government, both at a local and national level, changing rapidly. There was a shift in sort of long-standing power imbalances and an increased focus on trust on relationships, and fundamentally on community knowledge and decision making. So that really kind of underpinning the immediate response. I think, as Anne mentioned, it's one thing to be communicating what people should be doing, but actually channeling resources to where there was the greatest need was a key part of that initial response. And encouragingly, many local authorities in particular recognised that the energy, the knowledge, the enthusiasm around that sat with local groups, many of whom were long established, many of whom, as you've identified, had established in the immediate response to the pandemic. And I think there are definitely opportunities to look at how that relationship shifted and how that kind of adult conversation, the honest communication about what is possible, what's the challenges that government are facing, the challenges that society is facing, but also the challenges that communities are facing, can be brought much more into the round. When we're speaking with local authorities, for example, there is definitely a desire to embed those different ways of working to make that a more permanent shift. But we are also aware that there are perhaps an understandable move back towards pre-pandemic ways of working. So around community engagement, around community planning, around how services are delivered within communities and the extent to which, or indeed the extent to which not, community members are actually involved in shaping those decisions and have an equal say in how decisions are being made in their place.
So let me ask you a very concrete question, and I'm asking you it for quite selfish reasons. One of the challenges for the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government set up some working groups, and I was involved in some of them, asking precisely this question of how do you get community voices to feed in to the policy making process? And there are two big issues there. The one is, you've got to make policy for tomorrow, probably for last night, at the longest for next Tuesday, and therefore it's got to be something really rapid. You don't have time to have long consultations because by that point, it's too late. So number one, having something which is speedy, which has to mean, not everybody getting together, but some sort of process whereby particular individuals feed into that process. But on the other hand, that leads to the problem that with a lot of community consultation, the word community is used, but what it means is that those who are already loudest and most privileged and most articulate speak. In other words, middle classes, men, older men, people like me, and you've heard quite enough from me. So how do you make sure when you have community consultation, it is inclusive and that those groups who are normally silenced, those individuals who are normally silenced, feed in? What sort of processes and mechanisms can we ensure both efficiency and inclusiveness in feeding into the policy process so that voice really has an impact?
Certainly the approach that Cora has taken through our Getting Alongside Communities work is, as Jason mentioned, specific to the local context. So it's really understanding what's happening for people in that place and how best to start to engage them in a process or a series of conversations to begin to kind of articulate their aspirations and identify actions to achieve them. It is about walking in their shoes. It is about taking time. So whilst I hear the need to move quickly on policy, the answer is that actually the trust and the relationships need to be built up over time. And whilst we're talking perhaps more specifically around policy in relation to the pandemic, broadly within Scotland, there is a very enabling policy environment. So there is the Community Empowerment Act, Place Principle. Christie gives us a framework in which to actually start to implement some of those changes. But I suppose, given that we're 10 years down the line from Christie, it also gives us some examples of how that could be tricky to actually implement some of that change and to make policy making, decision making a genuinely participative process.
Okay. So in a sense, what you're saying is that for communication, for relations with the community, like everything else, whether it's the state of the NHS, the acquisition of PPE, testing facilities, you can't just suddenly do it when a pandemic happens. This is something that's got to be done long term so that we are prepared, so that when we're crises, we have the trust and we have the mechanisms for that feed in. And the very real danger is that, when the pandemic finishes, we all forget and everybody talks going back to normal, but in many ways we mustn't go back to normal. We've got to go back to something better, and part of that better is more engaged communities, more empowered communities, more resources to community groups.
Indeed, yeah, and I think whilst the pandemic has in many ways been a shared experience in terms of the hope, the fears, the anxieties, listening to Jason, there are also examples of communities who were already marginalised pre-pandemic and really are at risk of being left further behind as we start to move towards or through the next phase of the pandemic and towards something that more fully resembles recovery. So I think it is contingent to use the time that we have now to start to think quite differently about how decisions are made, how the resources that are available can actually be put more fully in the hands of communities and actually allow for localized responses to shape up.
So I'm going to finish now with a final question before we go to the audience and pick up on their questions. You have the ear of the National Clinical Director, who has the ear of the First Minister. So if you had a shopping list of the 3 things, I might give you a 4th, I'll allow you just 2, the things that we should do better, the things that we should change and build back better as a matter of urgency, what would they be as concretely as possible?
Wow, a little wish list. So I think we definitely need to work in a more coordinated way to provide a programme of support for communities. So what we've seen in a number of places is, community anchor organisations who've been really instrumental in supporting the response to the pandemic. But we're also aware that that's not the case in all communities, and a different type of support might be required. So I think there's something fundamental there. I also think there's something fundamental about access to space, and that might sound a bit strange. I know that public space was mentioned in terms of meeting outdoors, but for the communities that we're working alongside, there is a fundamental lack of space to actually be able to come together, to start to reconnect, to have those conversations, to think about how they individually and collectively start to move forward from the pandemic. And that builds into a whole lot more. We're also seeing a lack of access to services at a local level. And again, as people start to emerge from the pandemic restrictions, new needs are emerging, new services are required, and an opportunity to have a more holistic conversation around that, involving communities and government to actually come up with a different way of working would be great to see. Just to add in as well, I think if there is to be a more adult conversation between communities and government, there also needs to be perhaps a more adult conversation between Scottish, local and UK government as well, because some of the challenges that are experienced at community level obviously flow back up into how policy and financial decisions are being made.
So we have now 20 minutes left, which is my fault for allowing the speakers to go on for too long and going on too long myself, mainly because they were so interesting. Because when we talk about messaging and when we talk about information, of course, the government and scientists aren't the only people doing it. There is a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misinformation about the pandemic in general. There are those who will tell you that vaccines are there to control you and have all sorts of terrible effects upon you. There are those who will tell you that the whole pandemic is a scam. So how do we deal with misinformation? What's the most effective way of dealing with the huge amount of misleading and downright false information that is circulating? Jason, you must have had to deal with that. What are your top tips?
A great deal, and you've been one of our principal advisors on that very thing. I've also spent some time with a group called the Vaccine Confidence Project, run by an American, and but a global footprint to help us with vaccine confidence, which is a good way of thinking about it. And their advice, in summary, is the same as your advice: surround people with trusted information. Now, the trusted information thing needs expanded, of course, doesn't it, into what Anne described as the message and the messenger. And so my best example of that in recent weeks has been Young Scot, Scotland's young people's not-for-profit third sector organisation, an astonishing organisation pre-pandemic, but has had a wonderful pandemic. They have a health panel. They have a dozen young people who are their health specialists. They're not doctors and nurses or physios. They're just people with an interest. So I have spent time with them, with the health panel. The health panel have then gone out with the trusted message to the young people, not me. I've answered questions to the health panel, and then the health panel have gone on TikTok and YouTube and run Q&As on Twitter and all kinds of places. Trusted voices with the correct information and science out in the communities, surrounding those who are perhaps a little bit skeptical with the correct information. The other piece of advice I've had from those in this battle, who have been in this battle for longer than I, people who are really in the vaccine battle, is that you shouldn't fight the extremists. You should ignore the extremists and don't tackle the 5G chip people or the Bill Gates conspiracy theorists, or social media organizations should tackle them. So there is regulation that should help us with that. But actually giving it airtime or giving it any kind of oxygen is the wrong thing to do. And the right thing to do is consistently and optimistically share the best science honestly and openly. And we had this a couple of times. Right at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, you'll remember 2 people had very severe allergic reactions, unexpectedly, right at the beginning. So that looked as though proportionately we were going to get more allergy from this vaccine than we've had from previous vaccines. So we had to go on the telly and say, whoa, hold on, here's what we're going to do. We're going to now not give this vaccine to people with previous allergic reactions to drugs. It turns out, nearly 8 months later, that the vaccine allergy thing is the same as it's always been. We just got a couple of bad ones at the beginning. When you take the whole average, the science is the same as it's always been for any vaccine. But we had to openly and honestly go on TV and radio and say, well, here's what we're going to do. The blood clot one needs a longer answer. And it's been about trying to describe, and this is one of the things I've found very difficult to explain to the public, is risk. Risk is an enormously difficult concept to get across at a population level when you're dealing with individuals. And I've found that translation really quite difficult. And the blood clot risk is just one example of where we've struggled with that a little.
Do Anne or Alan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just very briefly, Jason, you were saying about trusted information and trusted messenger. I think the idea of the trusted messenger is so important, especially when we're looking at vaccine hesitancy. So I mentioned earlier that we are more likely to trust people who we see as being part of our group. We look to our group members for information when in uncertain times, generally, but especially in uncertain times. And if those in-group members are telling us that vaccines are unsafe, but then the government, who we don't feel represented by, who we feel like they're part of our group, are telling us they're safe, we're more likely to listen to those people who we think have our best interests at heart, which is our group members. And so I think building links with those communities where there's vaccine hesitancy, making sure there's good representation for their needs that government are seen to be working on their behalf, is so important for mitigating that vaccine hesitancy and building up trust so that information is then trusted.
It's been a hard lesson for me, Anne, that sometimes I make it worse. That's a tough lesson for me to learn. But I think it is, I'm flippant, but I think it's genuinely true. I think sometimes I am not the correct voice in whatever community or setting it might happen to be.
Mm. I think, I mean, a couple of points you've made, Jason, and I think are absolutely critical. I mean, the first is there's a real danger of conflating different things. So people who aren't vaccinated or haven't gotten vaccinated aren't necessarily vaccine hesitant. It's all for all sorts of other reasons, including practical reasons, which is why making it easier to get vaccinated is really important. Making sure that vaccination centres are close to people, making sure that people have paid time off work to get vaccinated. Secondly, the vaccine hesitant, who are only 4% of the population, according to the Office of National Statistics figures, are not anti-vaxxers. They're people with genuine questions and perfectly reasonable questions. I mean, people will have questions about the effect of the vaccine on fertility if you've got sickle cell disease. They're people who want questions answered. The anti-vaxxers are those who don't want questions answered because they've decided on what the response is in the first place. And one of the key messages of psychology, just to add to Anne's message about, we trust people if we see them as part of us, as in-group, is that if you treat people as other, as out-group, they become out-group. And to treat people who have questions with disrespect, to call them selfish, as Michael Gove did, to insult them, to call them stupid, is to drive them into the hands of the anti-vaxxers. So to me, I mean, one of the most important things is if you want people to trust you, trust them. If you want them to respect you, respect them. And I think one of the most important things is to recognize that many people have very real questions and take those seriously and answer them, and don't have a go at people because they have those questions. I think is absolutely critical. It's all about building that relationship. And that takes me then to the next question. I mean, if you look at the figures on vaccination, and there are some really interesting figures that again came out about a week ago from the Office of National Statistics. They tell a good story about adherence, and they tell a very good story about vaccination, but they show it's different in particular communities. So I mentioned that 96% of people are pro-vaccine, only 4% have questions, have concerns. That's much greater in a series of communities. It's 14% amongst the unemployed. It's 14% amongst Muslim communities. It's 21% amongst Black communities, suggesting there are very real issues of trust with particular communities. Now that comes back to something, Jason, you were saying at the beginning about the importance of understanding different communities and relating to different communities. But the key question then is, how do we build trust? And how, in particular, do we build trust in communities where there is a history of a troubled relationship with authority, a troubled relationship with the state and with government? So this time, I'm going to start with Alan, and then I'm going to bring in Anne, and then I may come to Jason. But Alan, any thoughts about how do we build trust, particularly with those marginalized and vulnerable communities where there is a history of mistrust?
I think some of it goes back to what you said, Steve, as well, about actually treating people with trust and respect. So opening up conversations with a parity of esteem, so that what one party shares is no more or less important than the others. In our experience of working alongside communities as well, it's really about spending a lot of time listening and acknowledging the potential power imbalance in terms of that relationship, and also fundamentally being able to support ideas to move quite quickly into action as well. So if there's a suggestion within a community for something that they would like to see happen, then Cora as a funder does have some power to support that. But more fundamentally, it's just about being on hand to actually encourage and enhance that idea, and being able to move from an initial idea into some demonstrable action is a really quick and effective way of starting to build that trust in that relationship. Anne,
have you got any thoughts?
This is a really tricky issue, and whatever I say is going to be somewhat reductionist because it requires a whole session on its own. But I'm thinking of work that was conducted by Selforganization and Govan on survivors of the Grenfell disaster. And we see this again and again in crowd psychology. But after disasters and during disasters, communities are fantastic at coming together and supporting themselves and self-organizing. They collectively self-organize to support one another. And often this happens before there is state intervention, before the emergency services even get there. And particularly when we look at Grenfell, we've got really marginalized communities. There was a real kind of tension with the state there. And what's been happening in the aftermath of Grenfell is the government have been trying to build up links with the Grenfell community. And the way they've been doing that, and I'm not going to comment on how effective it's been, but what they've been trying to do, I think, is work with the community and community leaders who know what those communities need. They've been in the community, they are representatives of the community, they have those direct trust from the community. That's a really tricky position for community leaders to be in, because they've really got to be seen as representing what the community needs. So it's a thorny one, but I think really it's listening to the community, really listening to what they need, because they'll have a much better idea than someone coming in from the outside.
Jason.
So my only addition is a couple of practical examples. Jambo Radio, Glasgow's African and Afro-Caribbean radio station, funded by a tiny bit of money from the government in seed funding, started by an inspiring African immigrant in Glasgow. And I did their Q&A on their news program earlier. I did it last week at broadcast this week. And I learned stuff about the African Mums WhatsApp group, which is actually where they get their information from. So actually what you got to do is get on the African Mums WhatsApp group to share information inside that bubble, because most of them won't listen to the 52-year-old white guy who's come from the government to help them. So it was a fantastic open conversation with a host who does a news program, who's from Glasgow, who understands the African diaspora, and can translate into a language that people can understand, both literally translate, but also metaphorically translate into a language that gets across. And I did exactly the same to Scotland's Polish community. The Poles are very vaccine skeptic in terms of whole countries. So a lot of their information comes from Poland. They're not listening to the UK government or the Scottish government's info. They're listening to the Polish info that they're getting from Poland. So you have to counter that in some form. You have to give it in a language that's understandable. As you said earlier, Steve, you have to take the vaccine to the community. So for our Muslim friends, opening the mosque vaccination clinic was a crucial step. The leaders of the mosque and the leaders of Scotland's political parties, who all went on the day we opened it, one of whom is Muslim, and the health secretary is Muslim, that was a massive step to get across that communication to that community and tell them vaccination was safe. And not only that, we've brought it to you to make it easy for you.
So one issue we haven't raised yet, which obviously is absolutely critical, is our messaging is insignificant next to the media messaging. And what's more, our messaging is in many ways filtered through the media. We're only heard to the extent it's reported by the media. And one of the concerns I had throughout the pandemic was that it's not a conspiracy. It's very much media values, which means that bad news and violations are better than good news. So a lot of the time, for instance, again from early on, but still more recently, we would have stories about people breaking the rules, about having house parties, about having raves. And not only did that misrepresent the reality, the danger was, and this is one of the paradoxes of communication, it set a norm that was counterproductive. If you say to people, look, all these people are doing this terrible thing, stop it, what actually people hear is all these people are doing this terrible thing, which makes them more likely to do it, paradoxically. And so at one point, I did suggest, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that the media ought to spend a lot more time talking about the heroic dullness of people who stayed at home and watched, watched the telly, or who read a book rather than going out. But one, I suppose, my question is, to what extent can one influence the media, not not by censoring them, not by telling them what they can do and can't do, but by getting them to understand the consequences of different types of communication and how much work has gone on within the pandemic to consult with and talk to the media about their impact and their responsibilities. Because as I say, without that, everything we do in the end is a drop in the ocean. Again, I'll start with you on that one, Jason.
I think they do understand. I don't think they need educated in it. I think some of it is deliberate. And in the main, the big media companies who get to most people, I think have behaved very responsibly. I genuinely do. I think the STV Q&As in the evenings, the BBC phone-ins, most of the GMS interviews, that kind of the drive time stuff, the reporting, I think in the main they behaved responsibly. I think UK-wide, Fergus Walsh probably did more to save lives in the opening weeks of this pandemic than any of us who were trying to do the communication, because he was in intensive care. He was showing people what it was like, what this disease was doing to people, and doing it in a really, I thought, very balanced way. We did some of that in Scotland. James Cook and Martin Geisler went into intensive care units in NHS Lanarkshire. And we tried to push quite a lot of that out into health boards to really illustrate what the disease was doing in its early days, when we were beginning to understand its horrible, horrible cost on individuals and families. And I think that worked. Now is harder, because as we remove restrictions, the economic voices are appropriately loud, of course, and the public health voices are still there, mine and others, trying to be appropriately loud, but they clash because those two worlds are not the same. I don't run Crieff Hydro. I don't run the nightclubs of Glasgow. If I did, I would be shouting what they're shouting. But if they were in my job, they'd be shouting what I'm shouting. And that's where I think it's got a little bit tricky. There's then the premise of your question, and that's the mischief making, usually in the printed media, not the broadcast media. Printed media not quite as powerful as perhaps the printed media want to think they are, not as well read or as broadly read, but if their story of breaking the rules or something makes its way into the broadcast, then that's when you begin to get trouble, and you can end up with days of counteracting a story not spent on making the public safer. And that has happened a couple of times across the UK, a few times, and we have found that really difficult. I've found that quite difficult and challenging on an individual level. It has meant I've had to follow the rules if that's any consequence, and had to be quite careful about following the rules. But that's no bad thing.
Well, I look forward to you running the nightclubs of Glasgow. After this is all over, I will visit Leechers, and I
don't think they'll have
an interesting time. I'm aware of time, and I want to give each of you 30 seconds or so. Just what's the one take-home message that you want to give? Is there anything you haven't had the opportunity to say, or I haven't given you the opportunity to say thus far, that you think is really important, or is there something that you really think that summarizes what you've been saying that's absolutely critical? So about 30 seconds each, starting with Alan.
I suppose the key thing that I've heard through this conversation, and has been something of a mantra of mine over years, is that it's all about relationships, and the relationships and the trust and honesty that need to be built up through those are going to be fundamental to support a process of not just communities and society moving through the current phase of the pandemic, but if we are actually going to genuinely build forward better or differently, which I feel is essential. So yeah, that would be my key take, would be the importance of relationships and the need to build those effectively.
Anne?
If we're going to have an adult conversation, then that requires trusting the public. And that means giving them key information, telling them what behaviour needs done, why it needs done, so it can inform those independent risk assessments, and supporting them to be able to follow the guidance, and really harnessing those group processes, focusing on that idea that following the guidance is an act of care. It is good for the group. It's looking out for your local community and harnessing that as well with leadership, so that the messaging isn't coming from someone seen as an outsider. It's seen as someone who is working for the good of the group, if not part of the group.
Thank you. And Jason?
Well, first of all, Steve, thanks so much for having me and us. It's been absolutely terrific. It's I would love to spend my afternoons doing this more often. It's a terrifically rich conversation. Pre-pandemic, we had a global movement, actually, genuinely sweeping the world, called What Matters to You? And it's about encouraging health and social care workers to have a moment in these really difficult dialogues we have with patients and families about what matters to them. And I think that has served us well in the pandemic, both nationally and more locally, when we're talking to patients in intensive care or families who are struggling in care homes. And I think that summarizes for me the nature of the communication, both at a country and population level, but also at a very, very granular level, when a lot of the pandemic communication has been with grieving families or with those in trouble economically or whatever. And it's a global movement begun in Scotland and Norway and now sweeping the world. It's called What Matters to You? And it seems to me to be quite good advice that we should start our conversations with that.
Yes, conversations start with listening. I think that's really important. And I think what we've heard from everybody is in many ways that communication is not just about information, it's about relationships and it's about trust. I mean, the good news is that when you look at the trust figures, they started off a year and a half ago about equivalent for the Scottish and the UK governments. Post Cummings, in England, trust plummeted from about 70% down to about 20–25%. That never happened in Scotland. And if you look at the polling and you ask people what they think they should do, most people, about 2/3, still say we should do what the government asks us to do. So in Scotland, at least, if not in England, trust has been maintained, which tells us that something's been done right. Whether it's the adult conversation, I don't know, but things could always be done better. And I think it's important, as I say, to be open about our deficits, what we've done wrong as well as what we've done right. But we shouldn't be gloomy. I think a lot has been done right. I would like to thank, first of all, the panelists who've been fantastic. It's always a good sign that we could continue talking for hours on end, but sadly our time has come to an end. And I'd like to thank the Royal Society of Edinburgh and Hannah for organising this event, which has been, for me too, a lovely and very enjoyable way of spending an afternoon. And lastly, and certainly not least, I'd like to thank the audience. Thank you to all of you who've attended, who've participated, and I hope you participate in many more curious events, and perhaps we meet again at some curious event in the future. When I say curious event, I don't mean Leech's nightclub, I mean a Royal Society of Edinburgh. Okay, we'll all meet in Leech's nightclub after the pandemic. So thank you very much, and goodbye.